What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name's Phillip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
And Ben, we're talking to Brooke Maggs today, the narrative designer for games such as Control, Florence, Paperbark, and The Gardens Between. And we talk everything revolving around narrative design versus games writing, and so much more. This was a really cool conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a conversation that helped me understand kind of what narrative design is. She does just a really good job of helping us kind of walk through like thinking about what it means to be a writer who writes in the game space specifically. And so we watched like some of her interviews and kind of, you know, she's someone who's pretty big in the game industry, I think, and has walked through like, oh, what does it mean to be a narrative designer? It's this kind of growing field. And I'm going to read this quote because I think it'll be helpful to kind of set up this conversation. But she talks about, so there's a quote from another narrative designer, Molly Maloney, who talks about the difference between a writer and a narrative designer. And it's that a writer cares about the character's relationship to the story, but a narrative designer cares about the player's relationship to the story, which I think is a great way of kind of framing the way that you think about like what it means to write in video games.
Yeah, and I mean, these are my words, not hers, but I think in some ways, if I were to relate it back to writing like a novel or something like that, it's kind of the difference between how I understand the characters and how they navigate the world that I'm creating versus the form of the novel or how the story is told and how the reader's experience is navigating the narrative and understanding it and having that enjoyable experience reading.
Right. And she gives this great example from Florence, which is one of the games we talk about. It's like this cute game about relationships, and you can kind of play it on your phone. But the example that she gives is like when Florence meets her kind of future boyfriend, there's a scene where it's like you get puzzle pieces and you have to turn them into a conversation. And as you get to know him, the boyfriend, the puzzle pieces get bigger and bigger and the conversation basically gets easier and easier. And so it's a way that like the game design is starting to reflect what's happening within the story of the game.
Yeah, and then outside of those insights, Brooke does a really wonderful job of talking through some of the more unconventional or experimental narrative stories or designs that are happening in games that she's worked on, such as Control, which is, you know, a bigger name AAA game with, you know, a higher production value, that if you're a fan of something like The X-Files or Twin Peaks, it's a mystery driven game that's about the paranormal, and it tells its narrative in a very non-linear found object kind of way. And she kind of walks through how do you make that an enjoyable experience for a player while also telling, you know, a somewhat cohesive narrative. So she kind of walks through what it's like designing games like that, some of the pitfalls that goes into it, and so much more. So it was a really insightful and educational, I'd say, conversation about game development.
Yeah, I think she does such a good job of making these big concepts that like I'm not an expert on, but makes them like pretty approachable.
For sure. So, you know, how about we don't keep y'all waiting? Brooke's going to do a way better job of explaining this stuff than we are. So without further ado, let's listen to Brooke talk about narrative design.
Roll the clip.
Brooke Maggs is a senior narrative designer for Remedy Games in Helsinki, although she originally hails from Australia. She's worked on a host of award-winning games, including Control, Florence, Paperbark, and The Gardens Between. In 2017, she won the MCV Pacific Xbox Women and Games Creative Impact Award for her role in the games industry. Brooke, thanks for coming to join us.
Thank you very much for having me.
How are you doing? What's up with Remedy these days? What are you up to?
I'm good, thank you. Remedy's going really well. I'm excited for what I'm working on. Unfortunately, I can't really talk much about it, which is the nature of the industry, but it's a... Oh gosh, I can't even say anything, but it's exciting. It's exciting because I have a say and a bit more agency in the world building and the story and the systems behind the delivery of the narrative. So I'm learning a lot currently in my role and really enjoying that. Generally, we're in summertime in Helsinki and it's beautiful and also quite warm, which is a nice change, to be honest. So there's a general update across the board.
Great. Well, I'm glad that whatever the secret project is coming along. How about we kind of go back, and before we get into like the individual projects like Control and everything like that, one of the things that we've been thinking about with this podcast is getting a better understanding of the roles that people in the games industry play. And it seems to me that narrative design, while maybe talked a lot about in like the sphere of gaming, isn't necessarily that well understood in terms of like what it is. So I'm wondering if we could just start there and just you talk a little bit of like what does it mean to be a narrative designer?
Yes, absolutely. Being a narrative designer it's a highly collaborative role where the core is a combination of designing the systems and things that deliver the narrative to the player, but also and the way they interact with the story, and also having an understanding of story and character. So there's a bit of a combination between story theory and knowledge of how to execute a good story, along with what mechanics suit the kind of emotion in the story we're trying to tell. More practically, what narrative designers do on a day-to-day can vary widely, depending on the seniority, but also depending on the studio. There are different responsibilities. But for the most part, we may help design a dialogue system if that's in the game, or oversee how we would like players to interact with narrative items, or if the character has a journal in the game, then we might be responsible for helping design how we'd like players to interact with that. We also might help with shooting and filming actors for the game, facial capture or voice capture, things like that. But on a whole, we help communicate the narrative and the story and the world development to the rest of the development team. And do a lot of things that are considered narrative work but are not physically putting words into a script. So in that way, everyone thinks that narrative in games is just the writing, but in fact there's a lot more. And in fact, you can really see that in games like The Gardens Between, or Florence for that matter, where there is no dialogue or there's no text, or not much of it anyway, but the story is still told and things still come through. We still feel by interacting with those games, and that's good narrative design. So I call it a combination of game design and with a specific focus on the player's interaction with the story.
Yeah. And so I was watching a talk that you gave, and you used this Molly Maloney quote where she talks about the difference between narrative design and writing is that a writer cares about the character's relationship to a story, and a narrative designer talks about a player's relationship to that story. Can you maybe unpack that for us?
Absolutely. A reader or a viewer or audience of a game are active, so they have motivations that are often related to gameplay, like solving puzzles or getting achievements or progressing in the game, that are not necessarily narrative. But games need the player to interact with the story to move forward. So we, I guess, focus on moving the story forward from a narrative perspective. So, for example, when I was designing the motels in Control, I was sitting with a writer, with Clay, and Jessie enters the motel for the first time and there's a black pyramid on a door, it's Clay who goes, Jessie's never seen that before, she would say something. So he's in the character's head. And I'm in the player's head thinking, right, they're in a new area, we've got to make sure there's an interact on that door so they know they can interact. But then Clay said, well, if there's an interact on the door, then she should say something like it's locked. So he'll make sure that that line is recorded, and we'll sort of bring together our joint caring for the player and the character. But that's not to say that one's, solely responsible for one or the other. They do cross over a lot. But I think Molly's quote is a really great way of showing where the definition is. So the character is how they're responding to the situation, and then us, from the player perspective, how they would be responding to the situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, Ben, the gardens between, you were just telling me a little bit that kind of bleeds in really well with that.
Yeah, and I should say, I was just I picked this up recently, and I was kind of playing through it, and one of the things I noticed is that you're not really controlling the characters. You're to some degree kind of controlling time. There's this time mechanic that you're using to move through it, and so. Phil and I have been talking to a lot of people, both in kind of the actual kind of novel writers and then also visual novels, and thinking about like what is the relationship to kind of the reader or player to the different texts. And I think The Gardens Between has this interesting thing where it's like it feels like as a player you are very much a part of this story in this way, where you're kind of controlling the characters, but you aren't the characters. And so I'm wondering if that's, maybe you can talk about like how that gets at this idea of narrative design and telling a story through kind of interaction as opposed to, say, cutscenes.
Oh, absolutely. That was a big question for us in a part of the development. The game director, Henrik, and myself and other members of the team would be like, yeah, but do we need to explain who the player is in this game? Because the main mechanic is moving time forward and the idea of time manipulation, but the characters have specific jobs. So Arena likes to carry the light to light certain flowers or take them to different parts of the game. And then Frent controls the time around different objects. And we had to be very clear about who had what mechanics, first of all, to tell a little bit about their personality. We had sort of limited ways to tell the story in that game, so we characterised Arena as someone who would walk forward first and who's often leading the charge. There's a collaboration, I would say, between the player and the characters because they're helping these events unfold, and we got into very deep conversations about this deterministic sense of everything that happens in these levels is theoretically going to happen, but as a player you're allowing time to move forward. So the reason I do this is because this is the constant motion that we would do to talk about time sliding, and we even thought about different ways of trying to show the player that they're manipulating time. We had different kinds of UI, like a slider that would let them put their finger on the screen when we were designing specifically for the mobile version to move time backward and forward. But then we didn't think that we needed that on the screen. So then we went to, well, could we have objects in the world that are like leaves falling or water or wind, things that show the passage of time, to show the player that they are in fact manipulating time and not these characters. It was very tricky to get around, and it took a long time for all of those pieces to come together and realise that sometimes going forward in time requires you to go backwards to solve part of a puzzle. And we did look at other games that use time as a mechanic, like Braid, to see how they did that. So that was really interesting. But in terms of the player's relationship to the mechanics, we did think maybe we have to explain that. We had long explanations that how do we introduce the player as their role? Are they a god? Are they turning the pages of a storybook? Are they... But then we realised that perhaps we don't need to explain that, and that disconnect isn't a bad thing. We were a bit worried about it. We thought that players would feel a bit alienated from the characters, but instead it doesn't seem to be the case. It sort of brings an element of joy to the world. For example, when you move time to move the little jumping creatures, that's a lot of fun, I think, and you have to really pay attention. So then the mechanics become about asking the player to pay attention to the events and to time and to what happens in the world. And so if we're asking the players to observe, then we need to make the world, A, interesting enough to observe and have enough things in the world that give players clues about how to solve these puzzles. And that took a lot of play testing to, just iterating on those specific puzzles. So for people who don't know, you need the environments in the gardens between are these 3D gardens that have fragments of memories between these two characters in them. So for example, one memory might be about them building a cubby house together, and then in this specific level you might do things like you need to move time forward and backwards for a character to jump on a saw in order to saw through a piece of wood so that they can get to the other side, or so it creates a bridge so that they can continue their journey. And so that time manipulation then, I think, helped the players connect to the memories more specifically as opposed to the characters. So if each level is a memory and we're observing and connecting to that, then we're investing in this friendship because each memory is about these two people becoming friends and getting to know each other. The whole story is about friendship. Probably should have started with that. So that's how we got to that point. But at the start it was a bit anxiety inducing about not fully explaining to the player who they are. But there are a lot of games that don't do that, we realised, so we decided to let that go and instead focus on what the game mechanics are actually doing, like what their purpose is, and that was more helpful. Yeah.
And I guess we should say, the game is about kind of excavating memory, and I even wondered about, to some degree it made me feel like you could even think of yourself as being one of the characters, maybe looking back on these moments, because the game, not to be too spoilery, is to some degree about saying goodbye to a friend as well. And so, it made me wonder, because you're able to manipulate time, it's as though you're kind of going through these memories, and there's also these moments at the end of every level where you kind of stop, and you don't have to move the controller at all, and so you can kind of be stuck in time and just like sitting in this moment with this that you had with this person. And it was like, it was a very like emotional experience for me, and like emotional, again, not through cutscenes or not through kind of a hard story with dialogue, but just like the movement of the mechanics. And so I think it's just such a great example of what narrative design, when it was working, what it does.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And also, I have to say, when narrative design really does work too, when the whole team gets behind the idea of what the mechanics are for and what the game is trying to say. So I think in absence of a narrative designer, if there isn't one, game teams can still really benefit from thinking about what are the mechanics saying about the story? Like what, we're being asked, we have to observe the environment to find answers to the puzzles. What does that mean? What is the environment? What are we always looking at and why? So that can definitely be something as well. And I think Florence is another really good example of a team, Mountains, who are based in Melbourne, who understands that. One of my favourite narrative design examples is the puzzle where, I'm sorry to divert to a different game. I was just
do it, yeah.
Of another example is one of my favourite ones. When Florence and Krish are having an argument, and you are trying to quickly, their speech bubbles, there's nothing in them, but they're little puzzles in and of themselves, as in puzzle pieces that you piece together to form the bubble. And as the argument gets more intense, you keep, quickly trying to piece the puzzle together, and you feel the intensity of the argument. And that mechanic is a repetition of the same one that happens at the start of the game when they first go on a first date and they're talking, and Florence is obviously a little bit shy, and you're slowly, each speech bubble has less and less pieces, so it becomes easier and easier to complete. And so we understand that the conversation between them is easier. We don't know what they're saying. We don't see the dialogue or text on the screen. We just know these speech bubbles are getting easier for us to piece together as a player. And so we really feel what's going on between them. Yes, and my part in all of that was to talk with the team more about identifying the emotional beats of the story first, and then figuring out, because they were prototyping mechanics and they were arranging a story, and then we looked at them both and talked about what the mechanics were saying about each of the story beats, which was really fun.
Yeah, I think looking at the catalog of games that you've worked on, and especially the ones that we're just talking about in relation to Control, the tones are all so vastly different. And I'm curious, when you enter a project, how do you approach that as a designer? Are you coming in at the start, or are you kind of maybe coming in later? And what's that whole process like?
For Florence, I came in a bit later. There was quite a bit there. Same for Control. For the Gardens Between, I came in quite right at the start, but the approach is different for each of them. Because I used to be a freelancer, I by nature had to be very flexible and ask questions of the team about the story and the audience and the game experience, and try and think about, if the project has already started, what are they going for? For Control specifically, it was understanding how Remedy wanted to do the new weird genre, and realise what that means for them. So I researched the genre. I was reading and watching reference material, talking to the team, reading documents that were currently created. But also, I have to say, that was really helpful too, was looking at a lot of the world building and art creation that was going on. We have a world design director who worked on the game, whose job is basically production design, but in a game sense. So what does the government building who deals with paranatural events and studying them, what does that look like? So looking at that was really great to get a feel for the world, but then also looking at what devices we were using. For example, Jessie was clearly the outsider in this world, and she was our way in to the world. So that was really beneficial to then think about what she knows and what she doesn't know. And then for me, I moved on to looking more specifically at the side missions, because that's what I focused on, and what they were specifically trying to add. And also the motel sequences, which had quite a specific tone again for the world, which was more being spaces of transition. So the player leaves the oldest house and goes to this strange motel, and they solve a puzzle to get a key, which allows them to leave the motel and enter to a new area of the oldest house. It was a way to open up the world a little bit more. So the way I got to understand the tone and intent was to talk to their creative director and talk to the game director, and then work with a team to pull together a sort of updated pitch for those spaces, because they were currently in prototype when I arrived. And then I proposed some, light puzzles and some ideas for making this space almost too normal and repetitive that it's strange, being a motel where every room looks exactly the same. And then the game director and creative director wanted each motel to have a unique signature or something strange. So in one, there's blood under the door, one of the doors, and in another one, someone's on the outside knocking to come in, and then, nothing sort of comes of that. It's just very weird. And so working on that, pulling those together and then reviewing them with the team and then reviewing them with the creative director and game director, so they would have sort of final says about what worked and what didn't, and I quickly picked up on what the intentions were. For Florence, I was in a consulting role, so it was my job to understand the team's vision for the story and what they were trying to say. And we talked a lot about romance and the romance genre and how romance plots work. And I talked to Ken about the meet cute that happens in romance novel stories, usually where we see the main character clearly maybe lacking something or needing something or wanting something in particular, and then they meet their love interest. And the meeting is sort of can be sort of the middle of the first act or the end of the first act, kind of depends. But that is the point where the main character's life maybe changes or it doesn't, but we kind of know that that's the person who's going to make them change. And I was saying in romance, often, like from a narrative perspective, we think about the love interest as an antagonist because they push the main character to change. Hitch is a good example of that, or Bridget Jones is a good example. Whether they change, hopefully not necessarily just for the other person, but the other person maybe embodies something that they need to find in themselves. And that was a topic of conversation we had for Florence, because Ken was really keen not to have Krish be Florence's saving grace. Like, she needed to be able to save herself, and he wanted that to be her conclusion. So, because I was saying, well, I was talking a lot about the meet cute, and he said, but I think maybe I'd like to have something before that shows us that Florence is, needing something. And I said, yeah, like we talked about what she could be needing, and I think a lot of my discussions were helpful in sort of talking about these ideas in different, especially romance plots, and how we could use them or not use them or twist them to help get this story tighter. And even at the start of that game, Ken was sort of saying, I want the interactions to be a bit boring. Like, I want them to be a bit mundane. So you press the alarm clock twice and you clean Florence's teeth and you fill up little bars like you would in perhaps other mobile titles. And you tap her social media, only getting sort of 2 ways to interact with that. And that, funnily enough, is the only sort of little fleck of colour that we see in the start of the game. And the interactions are specifically about being mundane. And then she finds a little something that she made when she was young. I think it's a butterfly, or it's some sort of paper montage of different colours. And she opens the box, and then she has a little flashback to her childhood. And then as a player, that's the first time that we get to be creative with something. We don't even have to rush to put these little coloured bits of paper onto the shape of a boat or a butterfly. And So this is a long answer to your question, but I just realised that's another favourite example of narrative design where we're specifically being a bit boring to show that her life is a bit boring at the start, and she's clearly yearning to be creative again. And then she meets Krish, and he is a creative person, but she also sees that that has consequences as well for him. So yeah, we were talking about that complex story and then how to actually get that across.
I should just say one of my favorite parts of Florence is the boring, quote unquote, boring segment in the beginning when you're just sitting on the couch and the only thing you have to do is touch the little sushi rolls to eat them. And I swear to God, every single time I get and take out sushi, I like cannot help but think of that sequence as I will just eat as of the just like tapping the sushi rolls to eat them every single time I'm eating sushi now. It's like just like embedded in my brain.
It's worked.
One of the things that you're kind of talking about, and I noticed this. You brought up the gardens in between, and you were giving a talk about kind of finding a narrative that works, and about how like, oh, the hero's journey doesn't actually fit. We have to find a different kind of narrative. And you're also talking about it with Florence and the weird fiction with control. You know, it seems like there's a lot of ways that the way you're thinking about games pulls from other kinds of literature or other kinds of genres. And I'm wondering how you think about, you know, mapping things like a 3-act structure or mapping other kinds of genres into games, and what, you know, for you is different, or how do you transform those things to make them work within, I guess, games?
That's a really good question. The hero's journey is very tempting to jump to in games because the idea is that you're, well, obviously going on a journey, there's a clear sort of beginning and end point. And if you're moving across a map in a game, then we can clearly sort of narrative contextualize that as you're moving across the world. You grow stronger along the way, you gather a party, you have mentors who help you along the way. Things get, you know, all is lost moment, and that works really well from a like game progression as well for contextualizing the player getting stronger, or what they, you know, and a lot of it is to do with sort of that power fantasy. But then there's a lot of really useful plots in literature and other places that don't necessarily turn on that idea that I think are very useful, especially for the kind of games that I've worked on, because those haven't been the MO at all. We did start with the idea of Front and Arena growing stronger in the Gardens Between and gaining these new abilities, and if we needed to signal that in a bit of an RPG kind of way. And I'm really glad we didn't, because it's sort of a bit more about the wonder of it all, really, which I think is really nice. I think very hands-on, practical writing skills, like writing dialogue, for example, is well learned and thought about in other areas like literature and film writing, especially film, because they have to be so clever. And even some of the best, you know, film scenes have no dialogue at all, again. So I think there's some things to borrow from like the canon of how to write and tell stories for games specifically, especially because, I mean, some games do dialogue quite well, but I don't necessarily think that's the main thing. Like, I think because if characters are, we do like to see characters talking, but often long cutscenes, unless you're down for that kind of experience, and I often am, I really like story games like that, but sometimes I would really like to interact, and so if the dialogue, that doesn't necessarily mean the dialogue should be interactive, but I like people that speak and who have opinions and wants and needs. But Well, actually, that's a good point. That is a key storytelling thing that is true across the board. I think regardless of medium, we need to have characters that we understand or relate to. And the way that we do that is, pretty similar across the board. There are some key rules that you can do to make characters relatable. And usually it's by showing them as someone who needs something or wants something or feels incomplete, or someone who is so complete and amazing that we kind of are just on board to see them be amazing, which is sometimes more of a superhero kind of vibe, though more and more superheroes on screen are having a lot of trouble. So, personally and are personally growing, which I think is really interesting. But I think I might be sort of wandering off the path here a little bit, but I think it's worth looking at other media about storytelling theory when you're feeling stuck, but there's no reason to solidly stick to them. Like, there are a lot of storytelling, like the 3-act structure or the 5-act structure or this kind of plot or that kind of plot. You don't have to stick to them completely, but they can be a good guide if you're not quite sure, where your story might be falling down. They're essentially criteria or heuristics to help see, people find my game or story quite boring at this point. Is it a story problem? Let's look at why that might be the case, and go through these tools. So I think there's a lot to lend to them, but then it's finding how to reinterpret them for a game format.
Yeah. And maybe another way to get at this question, I was watching like a Tim Rogers review of Dragon Quest, and he was talking about how the mechanics of the JRPG make it so that they kind of reinforce a narrative that is about friendship and relationship, because you're kind of figuring out how to work together with people. And so, like, inherently you're having a conversation. The story is about friendship and coming together with a team of people, and then like the mechanics also kind of reinforce that. And so, one of the questions that I think I have is like, what are the, what language of kind of narrative design or what language of games allows us to maybe think differently about the kind of narratives that we use and the narratives that we have, and do, the mechanical language of games give us other options for telling stories?
I think they can, yes, because narrative is often the context for the rules, like the mechanical rules. So the character motivations, the setting and the plot, good world building is often the stage for the character and for the player and for what we're going to ask them to do in the game for the entirety of the game. And narrative, I always say that narrative is important because at the very least it's context. Like, it's not, and that does not necessarily cutscenes or anything, but if there's an environment, what are you putting in the environment? Is it sci-fi? Is it fantasy? Is it the modern world? Is it a bedroom? Is it, a nightclub? It's the context. So when we understand the context, we kind of know then, or we're showing players what they can do or might want to do. And the mechanics, I think, can come first. Like, I think we have a game where we need to work in a group of characters with different abilities, and seems like a good way to start with telling a story about friendship. And I always think that sometimes we're a little bit held back, maybe not so much now with a lot of the new games that are coming out sort of are doing different things, but we're a bit held back when the main mechanic is often combat, or is always about combat. It's always shooting, or it's killing, or it's something. And the main sort of narrative thing we need to do on our side is go, why are you killing people and why is it okay? And why would we want to do that? Which is often why these games are war games, or they're post-apocalyptic survival games. You have no choice. Or these people are going to bring down humanity as we know it, or It's a zombie apocalypse and it's everyone for themselves, and this is a brutal world. Whereas if your main interaction is baking, that's a different narrative context. You might be baking in the zombie apocalypse. That could be interesting. So I think that, yes, I think the mechanics can tell us, because play is often more congruent with the character, is more meaningful when it's congruent with the character and with the story and with the environment. So we're always trying to balance what's fun to do in the game, what the character would believably do, which is why a lot of these soldier, war, rebellion, high conflict stories justify a lot of common gameplay mechanics like combat or stealth. And so I think that can be a trap, but there are people in the industry who speak quite, actively on this and sort of say there are other mechanics too that a lot of people enjoy, like growing things or looking after things or baking or catching fish or picking apples, or things that are, funnily enough, don't seem quite racy to start off with, but that make for really compelling games.
Recently, we talked to Nick Garan, who's the creative director of Spiritfarer over at Thunder Lotus Games. I think he talked a lot about what you're just getting at, of this friction between like making a game that doesn't have like violence as the main mechanic, and as you were saying with something like Florence, the importance of having mundanity or like kind of boring kind of gameplay in order to evoke those emotional moments. And something Ben and I were talking about Spiritfarer off air, and kind of the friction of like that kind of gameplay. Like, how do you make something that's kind of like repetitive or like quote unquote boring like fun still for the player, or how do you square that? And I think in the same token, thinking about control, something I was thinking about as I was playing through is, there is, there are cutscenes, there are like narrative moments that are going to push the player through, but a lot of the story, it unfolds like in the environment through found objects and player interaction in the oldest house. And I was just thinking, coming from a creative writing background, I'm used to seeing kind of these found object things and like collage essays or kind of segmented works, and there's a friction to it. I feel that I feel some players must have had, of like, hey, like I'm playing this game and there's all these different like objects and I have to read all these things and to uncover the mystery. And I'd love to just hear a bit, if you can talk about it, like what are those conversations like navigating, how do we tell this story that kind of, I don't think Control could have existed in a super linear fashion. So like, how can we tell that kind of story despite that friction that might exist with those kind of mechanics?
That's a really good question. We had a lot to do in that game to talk about the world. It was a brand new world that we were introducing the players to, and the main missions cover a lot of the key things. So we made sure that a lot of what you really needed to know about the world was in the main missions, which are usually delivered through cutscenes or through these video overlays of other characters speaking to Jessie, or dialogue interactions with characters. And you could, for example, in those sections, choose to ask them more about the world or choose to continue. One of the things the game director really emphasised was not sort of giving players as much choice as we could in that. To a point. We need them to experience some of the story in order for all of this to make sense. With the narrative objects, we're really lucky that Control is set in a paranatural FBI, basically. It's a government building that is called the Oldest House, and the Oldest House is a place of power. And in Control, places of power are often kind of imbued in a way with paranatural power. They're strange things. So we had a really great opportunity to combine mundane office culture with being in an agency that's all about studying and researching the paranatural inside of a strange shifting building. So I remember the workshops specifically, they're quite long ones, where the narrative team sat down and we made a spreadsheet that was all of the topics that come up in the world that we wanted to explain in some detail. And then we, down the other side, listed all of the ways that we could talk about those topics. For example, memos passed between people in the office, official government letterhead, bureau communications, research reports, I suppose. Whiteboards that we have around the offices. That's quite a Remedy tradition that pops up in Quantum Break as well. There's a lot of things on whiteboards. If you want to pay attention, they can sort of add some parts of the story. And then we mapped out, of course, what's covered by a Dr. Darling video. And Dr. Darling is head researcher at the FBC, and he creates these videos to inform the people in the FBC about certain key parts of the world. He does one on places of power, and he does one on objects of power and the motel specifically. And we used those as a way to storytell as well and inform the player of what's going on and what these things are, but also to create that weird feeling of this happy, strange government communication, style communication on top of, you fighting a paranatural threat in the world. So we covered all of those off, but we also knew that they couldn't be too long. And Clay, our writer, was very clear about trying to keep them succinct. It was mainly from a pragmatic UI point of view, because we sort of had that one sheet of paper on the screen that you could see it. And if we wrote anything too long, localization makes the text too long, say in German or other languages. But also just from a purely player sanity point of view of, let's not leave, encyclopedias worth of information in the world. Let's give them some things that that you would ordinarily find in an office. So what I'm saying is we're lucky that that's contextualized. So we have a lot of narrative kind of debris that we can work with that you would conceivably find. We were very clear not to put important documents or things that like too hidden. So we created a priority section of this spreadsheet that said, if this thing hasn't really been described in too much detail, then we would like level designers, if they would kindly leave them in areas where players are more likely to pick them up. And then ones that are a bit more abstract and a bit for the keen player, they are more hidden. So there's a method to the way that they're distributed as well. In fact, some of the first collectibles in the game are very specific and purposeful to lead the player slowly in and go, this place isn't right. Like, why aren't we allowed to take smartphones into this building? And what's going on? Keeping track of that was difficult, but we also did know or have to realise that not all players are going to pick those up and read them. So that's something that you kind of acknowledge as a narrative person in games, that not everyone is going to really enjoy those things. People come to games for different reasons, and some people just don't come to pick up things and read them. Other people really do. But we also created asset lists and spoke to the environment art department about what we could do to leave things around. But it also worked the other way, where the environment art or level designers would say, I want to put this thing in the world and I think it'd be really cool. What do you think about that? And we're like, well, we don't have heaps of time to explain it in the main story. We might be able to mention it, but let's make a collectible about it and make it really obvious in that area. So if people are curious about what this area is, then they can pick up a document and read more. So sometimes they were pitched to us. And that's actually really, really fun too. So some of them were coming in fast and hot, and Clay were like, Clay's like, okay, there's a rock. Why is there a rock? Let's make something up. And he would write something really cool. I think some of his clever writing is in those documents and really gives them a lot of personality. And then, but some of them trigger side missions as well. So it is to the player's benefit to explore, especially because, and not side missions that give you abilities, I should emphasise, because I think that's a bit rough. But some of the side missions give you abilities, but and so it does pay to explore in this game. I feel like I've answered your question well, but please feel free to ask more if I haven't touched on everything.
I was just gonna say, it's funny listening to you, because I'm having like this epiphany of like the kind of player that I am in some ways, where for instance, like, you know, let's say that you're talking to an NPC, and they give you the main dialogue, and then there's the options that's like, you know, learn more about whatever. I'm definitely not a player who's ever clicking the learn more about about like more. But then, for instance, I love reading the little documents found in the world. So it's interesting how that works out.
Well, maybe because it's a bit more active on your part, because you're seeking out the information instead of going, click, tell me more, and then they tell you more. But I mean, other people really like the snappy dialogue. Like I like some of Arisha's and Langston's dialogue in Control. Clay did such a great job with them. They're very funny. A lot of them are very sort of dry, a little bit sarcastic government types, but Arisha's really keen and a bit blue collar and stressed and in a tight situation. So his dialogue is great to stick around for, but not every player will, and we know that. So we try and keep the important stuff where they'll find it immediately.
I'm wondering if you can talk about, are there mechanics that interest you more or that you're excited about, and that, you know, you wish you saw more of in the industry?
I'm really, I'm sure there is. They're just not jumping to my mind right now. I mean, recently I've been playing again Inside, which is it's very in the vein of The Gardens Between, or vice versa. I think a lot of the interesting puzzle mechanics in there are great, and the way that it teaches you them is very clever, but I also appreciate that that's very hard to do. I guess what I'm saying is I like games that don't sort of interrupt things with many tutorials at the start. And I think I mean, obviously everything in context, and if there's a reason, of course, and we have tutorials in Control, and I think trusting that players will work things out is good, but also I do get frustrated if I don't kind of know what to do, if the game hasn't sold me my role in the game and why I'm going to do these things, especially if it's a lot of mundane tasks. They're not my favourite thing, so I need to be sold on the aspirational idea of why I will be doing these things a lot. And I mean, some games I've been looking at too recently, I've been really enjoying Subnautica. Subnautica is very, it just lets you go. And you've got to figure out you've got to look through your PDA and figure out what blueprints you need to build things and stay alive, and what gives you water and what gives you food. That's really clever. I also really enjoy... now I'm sort of just listing mechanics I enjoy now as a way of answering this question. And I guess that I would like to see more of in different aspects. I really enjoy Hades and their cyclical narrative, where I was talking to Greg about it, the writer, and I said, I'm genuinely happy to die in this game because it makes me stronger and I learn more about characters in the world. And like I said, the guys have done a great job where dying is a mechanic. You know, dying is part of it, and you're the god of the underworld, or one of them, so that's fine. But your, determination to get out is really interesting. But then I also find it interesting that you can kind of build things back in your base as well. So you're sort of a bit connected to going back to where you're supposed to be running away from. But I thought that was very clever. So, not feeling punished, but instead having that be part of the narrative and the design is really fun. And again, that was about context. It was about finding a narrative that gives context to a roguelike.
Yeah, we had talked to Greg maybe a month or two ago, and and he, I think I said the exact same thing you said, that it was kind of like a delightful experience to die in Hades because I got to like learn more about the story. And something that I've just been really ruminating on a lot lately, and maybe it's because like I'm a writer, so I'm like, oh, the story is like the most important part or something. But Greg basically had said that narrative isn't necessary in games, and that it's kind of like a tool in the toolbox of a designer to tell a story. Or I think you're saying it like it's kind of like it can just give the context if that's the only thing it needs to serve. And I find that, I don't know, it's just like really fascinating. I think especially when I was thinking about Hades, because it seemed so paramount, like the narrative itself. I don't even know how the game would exist otherwise. And I guess I'm just curious if you could answer this question too, of like how you view narrative, or like what is the role of narrative in games?
Well, I mean, it really does depend on the game. I think it varies. At the very least, like I said, it's context, and it is very humbling as a writer from other mediums to realise that maybe that's what it is. But genuinely, that's what, when I was freelancing and even on projects now, that I would ask, what do we want the purpose of the narrative to be? Because I don't mind if it's just context, but let's just be clear that it's context. Like, we're not necessarily... For other freelance projects, for example, I would say we don't need to tell a big sweeping 3-act story. Like, we can have, you're this, you're doing that. Why are you doing it? Because this. And so narrative is about emotion and connection to the mechanics and the world and the characters. And I think... I do agree with Greg. I think that there are games that are just fine without story, and there are often strange things that happen in games that have no explanation, and actually we're all happy for it not to be explained. Like, that's fine, and it can actually be a bit of a fault. Especially I've noticed sometimes in my work, I really want to provide explanations for things, and sometimes I realise that there really... perhaps doesn't need to be one. For example, the Gardens Between, do we have to tell the player who they are? Maybe not. So it's knowing where to leave gaps as well in the story. So I think the purpose of narrative is to, and often because it's the most flexible, is to provide that emotional connection to what you're doing and why you want to keep doing it. And the better ones also, I think, create a sense of curiosity or something that makes you want to keep playing and keep seeing what's happening. And that's what narrative does in Hades too, because it creates a sense of curiosity. Like, I want to know more about what's going on with, this god, or I want to see if I can do that. But there is also very clearly game mechanics under that game. It's very structured in a way, and sometimes we can explain those, perks or buffs that you get, or different types of weapons, and where do they come from, and sometimes we don't need to. I think Dark Souls was another good example of not really giving you a sweeping narrative, but more putting you in a world and letting you sort of work it out. And I think people don't mind that at all, because funnily enough, in the absence of narrative in games, narrative about games or speculation on the narrative, especially more and more with Twitch and streaming and our connectedness, we like to speculate together about a game if it's being particularly vague. So then we might go online and go, what was that ending about? Or what's this? Or I found a little note in Dark Souls. Like, how many other people found this note on Reddit? And let's talk about it. So, I mean, I personally like to play games that have some sort of compelling setup or context at least. But also, I have a lot of fun playing Fall Guys, and there's not heaps of narrative in that. Everything's just ridiculously cute. And that's enough. So I think the ultimate purpose of games is about the mechanics and the interaction, and that interaction with rules is essentially what a game is, and then how you contextualize them can be with narrative. Yeah.
Maybe lastly, and this is our always question, which is, can you maybe put us in a moment from your life, your personal, the Gardens Between level, for when you got involved or felt like this kind of narrative design work was the job for you, or was something that you were really interested in, and things maybe clicked?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, honestly, I think it's clicked over time. But when I started with the Voxel Agents, I was hired as a writer and on the basis of my writing. But then it became clear that we're not having text or speech in this game, but there was still a lot of story work to do. And I was at a point, and at the time, narrative designer wasn't a popular title or much of a thing. And I kind of came to it and went, look, everyone, I've really just tried to write a script for this game, but no one wants to have a bar of it. And in fact, that's not the way that it's going. It's very humbling, as you can imagine. But then I realised that more and more, of course, that story in games isn't just about the writing. And I actually really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed talking about the visual storytelling. And I realised that I had a lot of other skills that were not just in writing a good turn of phrase, and a lot of those skills were in communication and in conveying ideas and in asking people nuanced questions about the story, like, what is the purpose of story in this game? You don't have to tell a big story. Like, do you want to tell a story at all? And that's a question to be... weird question to ask as a narrative person, but I really like the design aspect of my job, and more as I've gone along, especially at Remedy, I learned a lot about the design aspect, because in a larger team, people really need to know how people are going to interact with the story. For example, when they pick up those narrative objects, how does that work? Do they pick it up? Can they listen to the audio log right away? Do they have to go into the menu to listen to it? And when I realised that there was a lot more to it, I continue with my own writing. I write a lot of fiction, but a lot of what I do at work is writing designs and writing about the world that is for the team to read and for them to apply, and also world build sort of on the fly in a way, but also laying foundations and being a part of the team. So I get to speak to costume designers and character artists and environment artists and concept artists who all really do story, but they do it from their perspective, and I really enjoy that. I really enjoyed when a character artist would say, I want to know more about this character, like, here's how I would do the shape language. And I'm like, yes, tell me more about shape language and characters and silhouettes and all these other parts of storytelling. So the point of this is to say that I really enjoy the multidisciplinary storytelling aspect of my job. And that's not to say writers don't get to do that as well, but I really do enjoy it and sort of have hit my stride doing that, I think. And talking about narrative design, I think, also helps people realise that there's a lot more story design work that goes on behind games especially as well. So not a specific moment, but a realisation that came to me over time that's really helped me hit my stride now, I think.
Thank you for that. No, I think that my final kind of question is, I'm always interested. The games industry is young enough that I think everybody who's kind of, especially at a senior role or at a higher up role, kind of has a not a straight line trajectory to get where they are. And I'm just curious, like growing up, were you somebody who was thinking like one day I wanted to work in games, or like where were you at as in young Brooke, and then how did you get to where you are now?
Oh my goodness. Well, yes, when I was younger, that is what I wanted to do. I remember having the Super Nintendo and playing Mario Paint with Mouse with my sister. We would sit on the floor and I would create sprites, which I guess should have indicated that I liked storytelling from a multidisciplinary perspective, because I made sprites of little characters and then little sort of ability, pictures that they had. And then I would tell her a story about these characters and put them on the screen and then wipe them off and draw a background and put them on the screen again. And I would just talk to her and make up a story about what was going on. It was probably something to do with Rainbow Bright or something that we were interested in at the time. And then I'll jump to another image where when I was packing up my life in Australia and going through sort of old boxes of things, I was looking through diaries that I'd kept, and I found a page that said something like, and one day I would really like to write for games, or something like that. And I nearly burst into tears because I wish I could kind of go back to young Brooke and go, and one day you'll move to Finland and you will make games. So that was pretty incredible. In terms of more practical things, I've always wanted to write, and I've always written fiction of my own, and sort of done a little bit of role play, tabletop writing and things like that. And then when I finished university, it was a multimedia degree. I really enjoyed the design and narrative subjects, killed the creative writing subjects, was grateful for the programming subjects, though those just skimmed through, let's say. And then I wanted to do web design, but I realised I hated it when I did some work placement. So I went back to school and did creative writing, but I also got a job teaching at Swinburne, who have quite a big game studies area. And I ended up just sort of talking to other lecturers and saying, yeah, I like games, I do writing. And they're like, do you want to teach some of our game subjects? We need a teacher. And I was like, sure. So I was reading a lot of game studies theory about games, loving that, working on my creative writing. I did a diploma in that, and essentially taught for 6 or 7 years project management, user experience design, game studies. Looking back on all of that, that prepared me quite well to be a good communicator, and also to study. It was like a second degree teaching as well, because I didn't do a theoretical degree. So I was reading a lot of papers on postmodernism and feminism and applying, Marxist theory to Grand Theft Auto and things like that, which was super interesting. And then I got a job at the Vauxhall Agents they knew someone at Swinburne who recommended me. I sent writing to them. Got to know people at the Arcade, which was it's a building in Melbourne full of game developers, small studios, and so we all worked there. And in the kitchen around the coffee machine, I would just, hello, I'm Brooke, I do writing and da-da-da, and I'm freelance, so... And then sometimes that would turn into things, and that turned into Paperbark and Florence, for example. And I applied for the Women in Games grant then, encouraged by other women in the industry, and a number of us won a grant to advance our career, and I proposed to use my money to go to studios overseas who have much bigger narrative games than we do in Australia. So I had to organise all of that myself. I had to form connections with the studios and things, which was excellent. It kind of got me out of my shell a little bit. And fortunately, some very lovely people at Remedy said, yes, come. And lovely people at Double Fine said, yes, come. So I went to Remedy first, and I spent 4 weeks in the middle of February, which was very, very, very cold. Like, a complete newbie to the winter, I brought every sort of warm thing possible and went to the office and got to see what they were working on, which was Control. And I thought, God, I have to do this somehow. I have to work on this game. So I was working as hard as I could. And then they did really appreciate my work and passion and offered me a job. And I tentatively freaked out a little bit and then said yes, but I have to finish my grant, sort of required to spend that money, which is kind of cool. So I went to the States and worked at Double Fine, which was so much fun. And I learned a lot from them. Came home, packed up my life, moved to Finland, and then worked on Control for the last, from the mid of development, let's say, to the end, and released that. And here I am. And that all sounds very linear, but believe me, it wasn't. There were a lot of periods of really trying to make things work. For example, I suddenly transitioned from, teaching full-time to also freelancing, starting my own company with a friend, which unfortunately didn't work out for us and we closed it. So there was a lot of moving around and then finding my way in. But I have to say, I think part of it is having writing to show people. It was networking and just talking to people about what I genuinely like and want to do. It was other women who said, you should apply for this grant, do it, It was the people, for example, at the Voxel Agents who wrote me very convincing letters for the grant, and all of that. So I think, it was definitely not a linear path to games, but I'm very glad to be here.
Well, thanks so much for talking with us today. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that you think we should?
I don't think so. I mean, to be honest, I've had such a good time. I feel like I could talk to you guys forever about this stuff because you've asked some really good questions that I'm really keen to unpack. So this has been great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to talk about my process and my job and the games that I've been a part of. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It was great talking to you. Thank you.
Well, that was our conversation with Brooke Maggs about everything related to narrative design. I think that she does such a wonderful job of talking through the headspace of a designer in games, especially in relation to narrative, and how it is fundamentally different from just strictly, writing games, which is something that at least, when I was coming into the conversation, that's essentially how I understood it.
Yeah, I think this was my first time understanding, dare I say it, Phil, the L word.
What's the L word?
Ludonarrative.
Oh!
Ludonarrative, baby. After this, I guess I'm going to go read some BioShock Crit. Maybe it makes sense now.
We're bringing up some decade-old games crit over here.
Wow. Maybe people made some points about the Uncharted games. I don't know.
That's some intertextuality.
That's a deep cut.
For our academics in the room.
That's a reference for literally a person.
She does a good job of kind of breaking down without, I don't even think she mentions ludonarrative dissonance, but
I don't think she does either.
She implicitly gets at, some of the friction that's involved of like making a game fun and making interesting gameplay mechanics while also, telling a story and like tying the gameplay and the story together thematically and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's like I think it's just like such an interesting way of coming at art that it feels like it is almost like inherently academic. I don't know, like that it's like so many narratives, it's like, how do you tell a story? And Brooke on a certain level is like, how do you tell a story, and then how do you make game mechanics that reinforce the story that's being told? And so it's like there's something, it's like from the drop, there's something kind of meta that has to happen there. That's certainly too big brained for me. I'm way too smooth brained for narrative design. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds stupid since it's literally in the job title, like design. But for me, I never really thought of like a narrative designer as being like a designer. I just assume like they're a writer who like, helps the story get made. But I mean, I think Brooke really showcases that I would almost say it's more so about the design aspect of it. How do you formulate a player experience in relation to narrative that makes sense, is enjoyable, is interesting, and bolsters and allows the story to even happen, right?
Yeah, like writing 2-dimensional chess. Brooke Maggs 7-dimensional chess. I'm just saying, James Joyce, it's on, baby.
James Joyce, they were doing like checkers, and narrative design is like that weird game in Star Wars where it's like the little goobers who are on that thing. Like I don't even know what the rules are. But
woo.
That's all to say that we really loved our conversation with Brooke Maggs. She has such interesting perspective on game design and a really interesting journey into game design, which is worth hearing. Brooke does a lot of panels, keynotes, presentations, and things like that in relation to game design. So she's a really good person to look up in terms of understanding more like what does it even mean to design narratives for games and how does that happen?
Yeah, and I feel like we should say, we watched a couple of her talks in preparation for this interview, and for those interested, I think we can just drop those on Twitter or something, so that like if you're interested in knowing more and kind of seeing her give a talk about how this works, there's a lot of those out there.
Yeah, and where can they learn more about Brooke's work?
They can find out more about Brooke's work at Brooke Maggs, that's MAGGS.com. They can also follow her on Twitter at Brooke_Maggs.
Yeah, and if you all just kind of want a good teaser into what her work is like, or again, if you're not really a gamer who has like a game console, I think Florence, which is available on the iPhone, or is in the Gardens Between, that's on iPhone too, I think.
I want to say it is. Hold on, let me fact check right now.
Those are both really good kind of gateways. Florence, I want to say, is a couple bucks on the iPhone, and very much so worth your time. It's also really cute, really great music and sound design. It's gonna make you sad.
It's gonna make you sad, though. It's gonna make you sad.
But who doesn't love that?
Gardens Between is also on the old App Store, so you can find it.
So check those out. Control is available like basically everywhere: PC, Switch, even Xbox, PS4, PS5. And where can they find you, Ben?
Phil, they can find me at sad_radio_lad. You can follow Origin Story at originstory_. You can also find us at originstory.show. Phillip, where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at 3DCisco. And as always, we want to thank Ryan Hopper for providing the intro and outro themes for Origin Story. And we also want to thank Melody Hirsch, who provided the awesome cover art and website design that you see every time you boot the show up.
All right. I mean, that's all I got. If you have any kind of thoughts or comments, give us an email at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. We're taking tips. We're taking, advice on who you might want to hear from next. Hit us up. And as always, leave those reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us out. We don't need to beat a dead horse, but they're always good. So love to hear from y'all. And you can catch us again here next week, Thursday, 5 a.m. Pacific, 8 a.m. Eastern, for another conversation with an awesome creator. Be there or be square.